I'm trying to think of who reported it, but there was that famous survey of the fact that in the early 90s there were more kids that recognized Mario than recognized Mickey Mouse, which was some kind of shrieking revelation to people about how awful, it is that video game culture was taking over. But in any case, Mario is historically significant, he is culturally significant, and Super Mario Brothers, even though it doesn't create Mario, which I'll get to in a second, it creates the kind of mystique of Mario that most people are familiar with, including the theme song and including the kind of artistic nature of NES video games. Huge. Aesthetically, awesome. One of the reasons Super Mario Brothers was so much fun was because it actually had its unique own aesthetic. It wasn't just that you were walking into the same old blocky game like an Atari 2600 game where everything is kind of just in blocks and cubes and then you kind of just move from there. You were looking at sprites, you were looking at there are unique pieces to how Super Mario Brothers draws the world and is able to scroll, which changes and revolutionizes the video game industry. Super Mario Brothers was not the first video game that utilized the scrolling capability of the NES, but it was the first one that got recognized to doing it in such an incredibly clean way that as time goes on, it really is kind of at the cusp of that change and development, of the fluidity of how video games operated, and very justifiably so. So aesthetically, it gets there as well. In terms of gameplay, it's almost impossible to ignore this. It's not that there certainly weren't side-scrolling games. It's not that there weren't platform games before Super Mario Brothers, but Super Mario Brothers is, in my mind, the absolute archetype by which every single platformer that is released afterward has to reckon with, and does. Because if you ever see a platformer post Super Mario Brothers that doesn't have the same kind of fluidity, you categorically throw it out the window. So Super Mario Brothers, I think, challenges Maze's assertion that we don't necessarily need, that you can't necessarily do all of the categories at the same time and still be a game that's worthy of inclusion. I think Super Mario Brothers might be a shoo-in just because of the way that it hits every single one of those criteria in incredible ways. So, thank you for the suggestion of Super Mario Brothers, which many of you echoed. DJB123 mentioned Pong. Pong is certainly worthy of conversation here as well. If not just for the cultural and historical considerations. Aesthetically, it's awful. Gameplay, not so great. But in terms of the ability to bring video games to cultural relevance, it's hard to argue for anything greater than Pong. Pong takes video games from something that crazy Japanese people did, with these kind of like casino-esque machines. Where you kind of had physical activities, to being something that you would do kind of virtually and at a bar and with a beer in your hand and playing a friend. And I just felt like that that piece of how video games come to prominence is insanely important. So Pong absolutely has to be in the final round for inclusion in my mind, because Pong is par excellence. Just meets so many of the cultural and historical significance questions we've got to ask. So if you're going to create a national registry of the best of video games, then I think Pong has to be on the short list. Sonic Rose, I'm not sure if she was the first. I think she was one of the first to argue for Pac-Man. And I think several of you talked about that. Talked about Ms. Pac-Man, which I think is also an interesting conversation. Perhaps, unlike the National Film Registry, perhaps the video game registry could actually include franchises rather than simply just specific games, as it were. And as we know, it's very difficult to categorize games because we have reboots and we have 3D, HD remixes and all those kinds of things, which films don't really have. I mean, there are, George Lucas, right, going back and kind of which is ironic considering the topic at hand. But in any case, going back and kind of fundamentally changing the film, even though it's the same film, it's a different film. we have that with video games as well, in droves. So, if you're going to include something, maybe Pac-Man is the best way to go, just because Pac-Man was so absurdly popular. Again, culturally and historically significant. There is no question about Pac-Man being either of those. In terms of gameplay, I'd say it's spot on. It's in a much greater degree than something like Pong, which could be very frustrating in terms of its controllability and in terms of its representation of what you're doing in the physical world, in the virtual world, or spaces, however you want to put that. But in terms of aesthetics, I think it also does a pretty good job there as well. Again, you probably wouldn't count the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man among the aesthetically pleasing versions. However, it's hard to argue that Pac-Man definitely looked very good for its time and was certainly good enough, even if it wasn't a beautiful game. So while aesthetically it's probably the lowest point for it, I'd say it's probably not the weakest, the weakest game out there. Culturally and historically in gameplay, I think it's absolutely at the forefront. It is massively popular. Whenever you have a pop music song that charts in the top 10 in the United States or in the Western world, that is simply about a video game, that's cultural and historical significance. You would be hard-pressed to find someone that is over the age of about 20 that has never heard of Pac-Man. And that is really almost anyone. Whether they play video games, whether they've never touched a video game joystick in their lives, it doesn't matter. They've heard of Pac-Man. They know who Pac-Man is. I think that's a good argument. I think that makes the short list. Red Mage talks about a game that I think is just a wonderful inclusion here, and that is Space Invaders. Space Invaders, as Red Mage so eloquently put, really does create, in many ways, the video game industry that we know and love today. For those of you that might disagree with me, I understand it. I understand what you mean, because if you look at how Space Invaders fits into the fabric of the time, it might not seem to be that much of a deviation from what was going on. However, think of something like Pong, right? And think of Japanese pachinko machines and kind of the pinball and things that predate the video game space, right? Slash, kind of permeate the first level of it, right? It's almost like if it's not a physical activity itself, like as in a pachinko machine or in a pinball machine, it's kind of that kind of physical input in Pong where you're rolling the trackball and you're trying to beat the opponent. It's kind of a representation of sports, right? It takes Space Invaders, and in terms of a massive scale of popularity, Space Invaders is the first game that really is massively popular, using something that didn't have a kind of, hey, this is a sports thing, this is a physical thing, this is cool, and it became something where it's kind of nerdy, it's kind of geeky. Aliens are coming from outer space, and your job is to get into this ship and blow them up before they land and invade, right? Now, folks, it's not difficult to imagine the leap that's involved with that. It's not just Pong anymore. It's not just hitting a ball back and forth. It's not something that jocks would do, right? Here is something where you're doing something fairly geeky. You're firing this laser from the ship at these aliens as they come out at you. Space Invaders is incredibly important in that regard because it creates, in many ways, the very experiences that you and I love, which is why we're here making this kind of stuff right now, because we love these kinds of things. It deviates from the norm. That's one of the reasons why I love it. Culturally, it's significant. Now, does everyone in the world know Space Invaders? No, but they do know its progeny, and its progeny is prodigious. Think of all of the ways that Space Invaders gets reinterpreted. Galaga is just right off the bat, the first thing you could say, is immensely popular, but Galaga doesn't come about if there is no Space Invaders. Historically significant, I've already mentioned that. I think that's exactly why it should be included here, is because it is so historically significant. In terms of aesthetics, it was not the best looking game in the world. I don't pretend to do that. But the ways in which you can create, one of the most ubiquitous signs for video games now is one of the Space Invaders as they're coming down you have the little icon, right? Like with the little legs, like a cross, like this. And so the game was created in such a simplistic way, you know, they just move like this, that it becomes kind of it becomes iconic for video games. And something that's iconic is exactly the kind of thing we're looking for here, right, guys? So, and then in terms of gameplay, there's no arguing. Space Invaders is an awesomely fun game to play. As you keep eliminating aliens, they can fly faster. They're in, you know, causing greater challenge and a greater degree of difficulty. It's hard to argue for the gameplay of Space Invaders as well. Great inclusion, Red Mage. Thank you for the nomination. Moving forward into Mog, who I want to say thanks to again for bringing out some of the criteria and really helping to balance out the discussion while the Commodore was on sabbatical. In any case, I love the inclusion here of adventure. Now, when I first saw this, what popped into my mind, what I thought Mog was referring to before as I took a preliminary glance, was the Colossal Cave Adventure, which is, I think, very much worthy of inclusion in this list. Surprising to see that no one named it, because I would probably put it in the top 10 that we need to put into that final list. Mog is not, however, talking about Colossal Cave Adventure. Mog is talking about the progeny of Colossal Cave Adventure, which is simply Adventure. Now, Colossal Cave Adventure is also referred to as Adventure, but the first game to use just the Adventure moniker for the Atari 2600, which debuted in 1979, is the game Adventure. And it creates the genre of the action-adventure for which things like Zelda come after and make immensely popular and immensely famous. If I'm running through Adventure and I see the cultural significance, not nearly as much. Colossal Cave Adventure, probably even more, just because the adventure game takes over at that time to being what everyone is doing at that moment. You know, the text adventure was it was almost like an evolutionary offshoot. It's almost like a Neanderthals, right? I mean, you can't, you know, maybe they're not still around today, but they were such an important force in video gaming. It was even more forceful than adventure, in my opinion. So culturally, probably not so much. Historically, however, very significant. Adventure is something that creates a beachhead for adventure gaming and for action adventure gaming, and it does, you know, inventory and all these other kinds of things that, you know, items for specific purposes that are just very well handled. We now think of as staples. And I think the industry would be very different, the landscape would be very different without them. So historically, absolutely. Aesthetically, I mean, it's tough because we're gauging it through different eyes. But back then, I would say the aesthetics of Adventure were actually pretty damn good. It looked very good, especially for a home console game. You know, although you were just a block, you know, there were dragons and keys, and I think everything, you know, the Atari 2600 was very limited in its capability to do something like what we were just talking about with the Nintendo, which is to scroll. You know, it has to repaint the screen for every single motion and movement. And therefore, you know, there were a lot of creative things that had to be done in order to create the mazes and the screenshots that the Atari was able to paint on the screen. It had to actually make half the screen and then symmetrically kind of post it on itself, which is really a neat little trick, utilizing half the computational power to do double the work, essentially. So, you know, it's a pretty cool example in that regard as well from an engineering perspective. And in terms of gameplay, I cannot argue with this. Adventure creates an entirely new experience of gameplay. One I think that we are. That I can't argue with. It's right up there, and so I think Adventure is a wonderful example of a game that should be considered for inclusion here today. So I'll leave it on there for now. I'm not sure it makes my top 10. Colossal Cave Adventure probably before Adventure, but it's there. I wanted to bring it out there. Troy Loza Tomata said Tetris, and I think this is a great answer, and one of the reasons why is really this is a great example of the cultural and historical significance over the aesthetic significance, and really even more than that, The gameplay being the absolute pinnacle of why this game